Claustrophobic by vrdant. Chat Noir knew he was claustrophobic. He didn't, however, know that one day it would kick in whilst fighting an Akuma. The Akuma was in space, and although Chat Noir had been to space many times than he could count, he'd never been in a tiny shuttle. A tiny, completely enclosed shuttle with windows he couldn't even open to refresh his frazzled mind. The small booster seat, like chairs, were too close together, and the front window was just inches away from his face, adding yet another barrier between his helmet and mask, separating him from the clean air, and the wall on his left side brushed against his forearms. And were the walls closing in? His knees were too high up as they bumped the control panels, and the top of his head brushed against the ceiling, and his suit was too tight, and his palms were becoming sweaty, and the heat. He could see the sun, or at least something that looked like the sun, in the distance, just a slightly larger dot amongst the millions of stars. Yet, he could imagine its radiation powering through every layer of metal and fabric, creeping underneath his suit and making home underneath his skin. It wasn't a welcoming one he'd felt whenever Ladybug squeezed his hand or kissed him, but a burning sensation feeding on his anxiety. He could hear the echoes of his breath coming back to him from the shrinking walls, faster, faster, and closer. His breathing became out of his control. "You okay, kitty cat?" Ladybug asked, head tilted towards him, but eyes trained on the astronaut Akuma, zooming in front of them as she gripped the control wheel tight. He nearly yelped when he looked over at her, faces close, too close. The shuttle was definitely smaller than it had been a couple minutes ago. "Sha?" she asked again, allowing her eyes to flicker down towards him this time. He fanned the air. "Are you feeling a bit hot?" "It's hot here. I don't think it's properly ventilated." He began to ramble as he tugged on his suit collar. "Well, it's just a tiny little thing. I don't even think it has vents," she teased. Chat Noir raised his hand to wipe his dampened hairline, only to bump against the solid shell surrounding his face. He tensed as the sweat beaded over his brow. He needed to wipe it off. He almost let out a cry of frustration as it slowly trailed down the side of his face. An uncomfortable prickle began to itch at every spot. His limbs touched something, and everywhere his body lit up with heat and stuck with sweat. "Are you sure you're okay?" I'm claustrophobic," he blurted, eyes squeezing shut. "You're what?" She whipped her head towards him, eyes livid. His hands reached down to grip the sides of his cushioned seat, claws digging through the ladybug pattern fabric. "Don't be mad." "Why the hell would I be mad?" You sound mad." "Well, I'm not," she yelled, jerking the wheel to the right as she followed the Akuma. "How severe?" Severe," Shock gulped, shrinking in his chair in a desperate attempt to distance himself from the contracting shuttle. It reminded him of the one time he had done an escape room with his cousins in London as a kid. They were navigating through a booby-trap pyramid, and Adrian had been ecstatic to figure out the puzzles and clues. He'd officially deemed escape rooms his favorite thing while watching a pattern of flashing lights occur on the step titles as he repeated them back. But then he misstepped, and the walls began closing in. Adrian was pretty sure that was the first time he'd had a panic attack, and the last. But he wasn't so sure of that anymore. Okay, I'll stop, and you can get out? Is that good?" Not trusting his voice, he nodded. He felt the vibrations of the walls stop as they came to a halt. "Okay, Shaw, you can just..." She paused for a few agonizing moments. The silence settled over the slick layer of sweat. Chat Noir snapped his eyes open. "What?" "The door isn't opening," she whispered from behind him, rattling the handle. "What do you mean it's not opening?" he yelled, ripping the seatbelt off of him and crawling towards her. It won't budge. You try." Oh, did he try? He yanked and pulled and pushed and banged, only stopping when he'd felt Ladybug's hand wrap around his wrist. Chat Noir, you need to... I can't breathe, he cut off. His chest began rising and falling, all jerky moments and 2 big breaths. Well, hey, you're gonna hurt yourself, Minou, she whispered, placing a hand over his tense arm muscles. Chat Noir didn't respond, only shaking his head. Hey, look at me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, he choked out, vision blurring. He took in greedy gasps of air. The blood pounded in his ears. His heart thudded in his chest. Somewhere next to him, Ladybug's voice was drowned out. His hands shook, he felt tingled, and his vision disfigured, as if he were looking through a fish-eye lens. His chest grew tight as bile rose in his throat. He hated this. He hated this feeling. He hated feeling so small, so helpless, so hot, so sticky, so dizzy, so unbearably disconnected, so isolated, yet so closed in. His body, the one he thought would never fail him, while transformed, felt as if it was going to collapse from the inside out. It was such a foreign feeling from the buzz of electricity and adrenaline that usually sparked through his veins from the magic of his miraculous. The thought alone of what he would have been going through if he was transformed was enough to send his heartbeat into another erratic rhythm. Then, a faint warmth amongst his terrorized thoughts. Not the unbearable heat that made him want to tear his skin off and soak it in the ice-cold water forever and ever. A familiar one he nestled a special place in his heart for. Through his blurred vision, Ladybug's hands shifted to hold both of his firmly, barely controlling the shaking in his limbs. Hey, there, she whispered, as she leaned forward to press a kiss to his head, or his helmet rather. Can you breathe with me? We're safe. Her voice faded back into the world. Chat Noir shuddered against her, his breath coming in short, rapid bursts. Kitty, I need you to breathe with me, okay? In. She took a long, deep breath in through her chest and held it out for a second. Out. She exhaled, slowly, the push of air fogging the glass surrounding his face. Chat Noir desperately wished he could rip the thing off his head. He wanted to feel her breath, her kisses. He wanted to feel her presence. Can you do that with me? She asked again, drawing in a deep breath. She watched patiently as Chat Noir took in a shaky gasp, eyes unfocused and head tilted towards the floor. Can you see me, Chat? Ladybug asked a few moments later, voice gentle. Could he see her? No, he exhaled, his heart pounding again. Why couldn't he see her? It's okay. Can you see anything at all? She tried again, thumbs rubbing his hands. Chat Noir shook his head. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, Ladybug. None of that. It's not your fault, Kitty, then hesitantly. Could I sit down next to you? Chat Noir nodded, moving to fidget with his hands when she dropped them. Settling next to him, they sat shoulder to shoulder against the wall. Do you know the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding method? Ladybug began, after a few minutes of silence, gracefully too. Her voice was beginning to fade out by the pounding in his ears again. Pound. His eyebrows furrowed as he raked through his frazzled mind, but no thoughts came. I don't think I do, he whispered, squeezing his eyes to elevate the pressure in his head. Pound. My mother used to guide me through it whenever I had a panic attack, she recounted softly. Chat Noir could only imagine the bittersweet smile she wore as she spoke. We start with 5 things you can see. Can you do that? Pound. Chat Noir lifted his heavy head up, nausea crawling up his throat. Blinking back the tears that threatened to fall, he squinted around the shuttle. The walls. Then, they're getting smaller. Pound. Hey, don't look at the walls. Focus on me. He turned towards her, he blinked, gaze darting around until Ladybug's face came into view. The left side of her face was lit up by the glow of the control panel. He stared down into her eyes, breath coming fast and sharp, and each one barely taking in air at all. His head swam, vision rippling, darkening, closing in. He was going to pass out at any second. He could feel his heart slowing down, and for once, he wished for it to spur and beat dense into his chest. And, Chat Noir, 5 things, you got this, Ladybug repeated, taking his hand once more. Chat Noir squinted as he processed her words. He tried desperately to hear past the pounding in his ears. Polka dots, pound. A little bit of an eyesore, she chuckled. Pound, and, Chat Noir narrowed his eyes straight ahead. Steering wheel, pound. Anything else? He focused back on her. I see your hair ribbons and your eyes. Pound, 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 pound. Her chest swelling smile made his heart pound a little softer, a little sweeter. Now, can you tell me 4 things you can feel? Reflexively, his hand grabbed hers. This, I feel your hand, then a little more strain. I feel the heat too, and my sweat. I feel sick. She frowned. That's 4. Any better? She squeezed his hand. The room had started to warm up earlier, but the lack of air conditioning was really becoming apparent now. Chat Noir was positive he'd already sweated damp patches into the suit. He began to notice how much easier air filled his lungs. He looked down at their conjoined hands. His vision was slipping back to normal, clearing, his hands still quivering but less so, and suddenly he could hear so much more than his own heartbeat again. It's helping. She didn't really look convinced. Really, I promise. Well then, how about 3 things you can hear? Your voice, he answered immediately. She laced their fingers together. My voice and... Chat Noir paused, cat ears flickering. He looked around the shuttle. And your breathing, she laughed. Sharp hearing, she commented, a grin tugging at her lips. He chuckled, the first genuine laugh since he'd got inside the shuttle. Okay, the next thing you do would be to tell me 2 things you can smell, but... Ladybug trailed off, waving her hand around the mask covering her own face. That's fine, Chat Noir smiled. The snigging behind his ears subsided, and his breath began to even out in a rhythm that matched the rise and fall of Ladybug's chest. He watched fondly as she readjusted herself before turning back to him with a shy smile. Well, that leaves one more thing. 1 thing you can taste, she said. Chat Noir didn't miss the way her eyes flitted to his lips. The trailing of her sentence left them in silence, only broken by the rustle of suits and their quiet breathing. I can't kiss you through the helmet, you know that, right? Chat Noir teased, the familiar wolfish grin making him home on his face. Ladybug's eyes bugged out. What? No, I didn't, she fumbled, cheeks red. He laughed, one that came from his stomach and carried throughout the entire shuttle, joyous and genuine and real. Ladybug buried her face in her hands, but Chat Noir could see her eyes flash with mirth in her suppressed smile. The precious smile he held so dearly to his heart. And even as he pulled her into a hug, stifling the last of his laughter into the crook of her neck, the smile stayed, the one that could replace the need for a sun in the solar system, that could be seen galaxies away. All the incandescence, all the cosmos aside of their shuttle just didn't hold a candle to her smile. Thank you, Ladybug, he whispered, letting his head rest over hers, for everything. She hummed, You don't have to thank me. Then shyly, You know I love you, right? Chat Noir sighed happily. He tangled his fingers through her hair. And I love you.